you know, the Afghans for 35 years have suffered from a leadership which has always been viewed as illegitimate by half the population. Daoud did a coup against the king, you know, the communists came in, then the Russians came in, then you had a civil war, and then the Americans came in. So everybody has been somebody's stooge at some point of time or the other. And the question of legitimacy becomes critical, absolutely. Karzai's legitimacy was essentially built on the fact that, you know, he was being backed by foreign forces. And that's something that today he's trying to get rid of that legacy, which is why he's creating all these problems with the bases and not giving the bases to the Americans. But I think there are a whole range of issues which could emerge and which would be intractable, unfortunately. We don't have a mediator. We don't have an international presence as such. We desperately need an international mediator to be given the powers by the West and hopefully by the Afghans to ensure that there's not a complete mess in these elections.
So, I mean, the critical question is what might be the outcome of this election and who might be president in Afghanistan after the elections?
Well, I'm not going to predict that, because the Afghans will then jump down my throat and say that, you know, I was trying to rig the elections like Holbrooke was or something. But no, I think the common assumption is, the common denominator is that it will probably be a Pashtun president in alliance with, you know, some of the other ethnic groups, and hopefully that, you know, this president will be considered legitimate, not just by the majority of Afghans, but by the Taliban too. And that could encourage the Taliban to actually talk to the government, something they've refused to do with Karzai because they've labeled him as the stooge of the Americans.
Okay, so that brings us on. I mean, you're sort of complaining a bit about the withdrawal as leaving a vacuum of authorization and coordination surrounding the elections. But it is a fact, the drawdown in 2014, this year. How do you see it playing out? What do you think it'll look like by the end of the year?
You see, I think the real fear in the region, including, and by that I mean Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Central Asian states bordering Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the real fear is that actually everybody's walking away. And there's going to be a replay of 1989 and the Soviet withdrawal. The West does not have the money, it doesn't have the will, it doesn't have the intentions to do anything more in Afghanistan and Pakistan, for that matter. That this aid junket that, you know, has helped Pakistan sustain itself under Musharraf and all that is going to disappear in a year or two. And we have to stand on our own feet, and we're totally incapable of doing that right now. Same goes for the Afghans. I think the overall fear is that, you know, and this whole pivot to the Far East that, you know, Obama's talking about, the importance of China, the mess in the Middle East, which is obviously going to take up far more attention than ever before, even though nobody seems to have any answers to Iraq, Syria, Libya, all these other problems. The feeling is that the West is really going to walk away. And, you know, there's the promise of aid to Afghanistan for 5 years for the military, 5 years for the budget. If you talk to most Afghans, they'll say, you know, we'll be lucky if we get 1 year or 2 years max. After that, Congress will just, you know, scuttle the whole thing. And the British Parliament will scuttle the whole thing. And the Europeans will not give that kind of money because there'll be so many other pressing demands. And so I think that is really, and that's why you're seeing this huge capital flight out of Afghanistan, even Pakistan. And you're seeing talent flight, you know, the whole educated elite which emerged in Afghanistan in the last decade. A lot of them want to leave or are leaving. And that doesn't bode well for the future, you know.
And what do you see that impact being on Afghanistan on the ground? I mean, there is an argument that says other regional players may walk into the space left by the departure of Western forces.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of that, and there's a lot of people saying that this will be a rehash of the 1990s when all the neighboring states plunged into backing one warlord or the other in Afghanistan. Now, I think there are a couple of big differences. The first is that most of the states around Afghanistan today are failing states. We should remember that. You know, the Central Asians, Pakistan, Iran are failing states.
Iran a failing state?
I mean, in many respects, I mean, it's totally isolated from the world unless this whole Obama deal goes through. You know, the economy is in a total...
Well, so far there is being progress there, so...
Sorry?
In Iran, there is progress on that, isn't there, on this nuclear deal? So
well, there is, and they also have oil, which of course, you know, if they were to comply with everything and the sanctions are lifted, of course, oil would again refloat them. And Iran perhaps is a long shot, but, you know, certainly Pakistan and Central Asians are in a very bad way. And even the Arabs are not going to arm the Taliban the way they armed them in the 1990s. You know, the Arabs are far too preoccupied with their own, you know, Syria, Iraq, and all the rest of it. So I think that's the first difference. And I think secondly, all the neighboring states genuinely do want to see peace and stability in Afghanistan. I don't think there's a bad egg here in which you can say that, well, Pakistan's ISI wants, you know, to support Mullah Omar, or the Iranians want to support Abdullah, or whatever it is. I think everybody genuinely wants to see a peace and stability because they know that their own countries are in a mess. They don't have the money to back an endless civil war in Afghanistan, and they would like to see a reconciliation. But that goes with a caveat. And the caveat is that if there is a meltdown in Afghanistan after the elections, and then one country or more feel the need to back their particular horse in Afghanistan as a result of that meltdown, then everybody will pile in again. And that will then create a very, very dangerous situation. You know, but I think, again, I mean, that's why I'm saying I really think we need an international mediator, and we need some international focus on post-election Afghanistan, precisely in order to prevent this kind of intervention by the neighboring powers. And we need a regional settlement. We need the regional countries, something Holbrooke tried 2-3 years ago, which has basically been abandoned by Obama now, and by the Europeans, and by NATO. There's no real movement on this idea of a regional settlement. There are several processes going on, Istanbul process and other processes, but they haven't yielded anything, and they're unlikely to.
Well, critical player here, of course, is Pakistan. So let's talk a bit now about Pakistan and Afghanistan. What's the view there about what the year might bring in Afghanistan and its implications?
Well, you know, I mean, I think Pakistan's position compared to 3 or 4 years ago has certainly changed, and that's partly because of the domestic situation in Pakistan, the growth of terrorism, the collapse of the economy, etc. Even the military now realizes that the days of intervention in Afghanistan, like a la 1980s and a la 1990s, is now over. So I think Pakistan, by and large, wants to support a peace, you know, stability in Afghanistan, like all the other neighbors. But Pakistan has several problems, you know, that it faces. Number one, it houses all the Taliban. The entire Taliban leadership is housed in Pakistan. Now, I've been one of those who have been saying for the last 1 year, Pakistan has been helping this reconciliation process between the Taliban and the Americans, and the Doha process, which collapsed, unfortunately, and trying to get the Taliban to talk to Karzai and other things. But I think there's much more that Pakistan can do and should be doing. I think Pakistan has to play a much bigger role on the positive side, rather than still trying to hedge its bets between not annoying the Afghan Taliban too much and you know, pushing a bit here but pulling back here. So I think Pakistan has a much larger role to play, a more significant role to play, and certainly the Afghan Taliban are not going to feel the need to go in quickly for a settlement with Kabul unless there's going to be real push from Pakistan. And unless Pakistan really tells the Afghans, listen, I'm sorry, mate, you've lived here long enough, you've been living here since 1993, or even earlier, it's time for you now, you Taliban, to go back home. And we're not going to force you to go back home, but we want you now to have a settlement with Karzai, settle the deal, go back home as citizens of Afghanistan. you know. And I think there's much more. Now, Pakistanis will, you know, the military and officialdom will all say, well, yes, but where's the West? Where's the, you know, where are the Americans in this? The Obama White House is at loggerheads with the Defense Department and the State Department over these issues. And we're not going to move an inch until we're sure that the West is backing us. Well, these are, you know, it's like the Middle East right now. I mean, you know, the point is that the West is not going to be there to back any, you know, it's going to be up to Pakistan to take the initiative. And I think, you know, Nawaz Sharif certainly realizes this and realizes what needs to be done. But he's hampered by, you know, many of these problems. The fact that Taliban are there, the fact that there's domestic terrorism, the fact that he has to build a relationship with the new army chief who's just come in, the fact that the economy is down the tubes completely. He's, you know, but I think, you know, people now at the top in the army and the civil do understand that if they want peace and stability, they probably at the end of the day will have to do more.
And do you think that there's a coincidence of views now then between the army and the security and the civilian government in Pakistan on this?
I think there's much, there is a much of coming together for the first time. But that is not to say that the army and the intelligence services are not going to keep some of their powder dry. In other words, some of these Afghan Taliban groups, like the Haqqanis, for example, and other such groups, are going to be kept in reserve in case everything breaks down. And there's a meltdown, as I said, in Afghanistan, and muscle is needed at some stage in the game. If muscle is needed, then, you know, we will be keeping those people, you know, and actually surrendering the muscle back to Kabul is going to be the last step, if you like, of a peace and reconciliation process. Will we actually get there is the real question. I mean, I hope so. But, you know, but everybody is going to keep, I mean, you know, the Iranians are going to keep, you know, certain warlords on their payroll in case everything breaks down. The Russians are going to do the same through the Central Asians, through Uzbekistan in particular. So it's not, but I mean, what I'm really, you know, I'm very keen that what happens, I mean, they can do that, but as long as they don't interfere directly by sending arms, ammunition, and fueling civil war and dissension inside the country, like the neighbours did in the 90s.
One regional player you haven't mentioned is China. Some people say, well, you know, we're seeing Western powers removing themselves from Afghanistan at this point. Maybe a change with history will be that China will come in. It needs the raw materials.
No.
It's already investing.
No. I think, you know, the frustration with China is what you all face when you deal with China and North Korea. You know, is that China will not play a political security role in these problem states which border it. I mean, Afghanistan is a direct neighbor of China. Now, China is not going to move in and be a peacekeeping force or a peacekeeping factor or a mediating factor between Afghan factions after the elections. So China will wait for somebody else to do all that, you know, and that's the real problem. I think right now the Americans and the West would love the Chinese to get, you know, come up with some political solution in North Korea, come up with some of the political solution in some other places also. But China is certainly not going to do that in Afghanistan. It's not going to get involved. Now, if in 5 years' time or in 3 years' time, peace breaks out and, you know, the Taliban are reconciled with Kabul, etc., yes, the Chinese are going to become by far the most important players in Afghanistan. There are huge resources of oil and gas, minerals, which China can exploit directly and take back to China. India is also a potential source, but India is one step removed. India doesn't share a border with Afghanistan, and in between is Pakistan, which of course creates problems for India. But nevertheless, you know, India and China are the two countries that will, but investing in Afghanistan, in the mineral wealth, and for people who are saying, well, the mineral wealth is going to save Afghanistan because that's going to be the real income. But nobody is going to invest that kind of billions and billions in Afghanistan unless there is real peace and stability and a legitimate government. I think, people have had their fingers burnt far too much, especially if you remember the 90s with the pipeline projects bringing gas from Turkmenistan and other such things. People are Western companies, Chinese companies, Indian companies are not going to get their fingers burnt. And in fact, in the last few weeks, both the Chinese and the Indians who've invested considerable amounts, or promised to invest considerable amounts in copper and iron ore and other things, have actually pulled out some of their sums. And they're reducing their projects. I mean, there was much talk about a railway being built in Afghanistan so that this copper ore and iron ore could actually come out of Afghanistan. I mean, they both scarpered that program now. So really, I mean, and the Chinese are not going to bring peace to Afghanistan. And to expect them to do so would be, pie in the sky. But if there is peace, certainly the Chinese would help develop that country.
You talked about, could there be a possibility of a new president being someone who the Taliban would talk to? Another way for the Taliban to come back is just to come back, take over territory, as they already seem to be doing. You paint quite a potentially gloomy scenario in Afghanistan. Let's take it a step further in gloom. Do you think that the Taliban could come back and it could once again become this ungoverned space, part of it anyway, which would present a real threat to Western nations as a springboard for extremists?
I think the Taliban right now are very divided amongst themselves and quite confused. But what I will say is that there is I think there's a genuine peace lobby in the Taliban. There's a genuine lobby in the Taliban who believe several things. We don't want another 20 years of civil war. We are Afghans, and we will have to leave Pakistan eventually and go back to Afghanistan. And we don't want, we don't want to be called the stooges of Pakistan, just like the Afghan government is already calling us the stooges of Pakistan. Nobody will support us, and even this black money that is coming in from the sheikhs in the Arab world and from the Pakistani militant groups and other such, a lot of that black money is being shut down by the Americans and, stricter regulations and all the rest of it. So there is I think there's and lastly, I mean, most sensibly, the sensible Taliban will tell you directly, we failed at governing the country when we ruled the country in the 90s. And we will still fail if we were to rule because we don't have anyone. We don't have any educated people. We don't have any technocrats or anything else. So rather than rule the country and earn the wrath of the Afghan population within the first 3 months of ruling Afghanistan, better that we, seek some kind of political alliance with the existing government, which is accepted by the West, which means that aid will continue to flow, and Afghanistan will not just be the basket case as it was under Taliban rule in the late 90s. Remember, when 9/11 happened, Afghanistan was on the verge of collapse. People tend to forget that. There was a massive exodus of people. There was a new stream of refugees. There was starvation. There was drought. There was, huge problems. And Osama bin Laden was just the icing on the cake at that time, So, but yes, there are hardliners in the Taliban. There are people who are very influenced by global jihad, influenced by reconquering Afghanistan, wanting the whole thing, the whole Sharia, Islamic law bit in the country. But, I think if we have a free and fair election, if there's a good leader in Kabul, if, this American base issue is more or less resolved, I think we may well see a further shift and a strengthening of the peace lobby rather than a strengthening of the war lobby, if you like.